This isn't just about rich people. Everybody can do this. When we were much younger, we were active in our community planting trees. Not expensive, but we were active doing that. And then developing little parks, pocket parks, and then helping organize our community so that in community efforts we were able to get the money together to buy land or conserve a piece of land. I don't want your listeners here to simply say, oh yeah, this is some rich guy that's able to do this, I can't do it. No, I want everybody to realize that at this particular moment in the history of the planet, we need to act to be able to move at all levels, in cities, in suburbs, in farms, in every way, play at 100% with respect to shifting focus to conserve these natural areas on the planet.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. How are you today, David? I understand it's very snowy over there in the East Coast.
It's very snowy. I understand Ralph is in California to welcome Attorney General Jeff Sessions.
Yes, who's suing the state of California.
Yes.
That's the big news out there.
Yeah, and that voice you just heard is the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hi, Steve.
We have a very exciting show today. This is a very positive show. A lot of times it's up to us to shine a light on government and corporate malfeasance, where things are going wrong. We also always try to light your path to the good fight, but today is more of a feel-good show. Our guest today is actually a corporate executive. We don't often interview corporate executives. I don't know, something about the show turns them off. I don't understand what that could be. but our guest today, Jack Dangermond, is no ordinary corporate executive. He is not only an incredibly successful businessman, but also an environmental scientist whose company develops mapping software that can be used in an environmental context like topography, natural resources, sustainability, but also in a host of other industries like education, public safety, transportation, and banking, all sorts of demographic mapping. In fact, in the early 90s, one of Ralph's groups used these mapping tools to identify banks and mortgage lenders that were redlining minority neighborhoods. But our main story today, the feel-good story, is how Mr. Dangermond and his wife have used their wealth to preserve some valuable California coastal land. As always, we will also check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber, and we'll use any remaining time in the show to answer more of your listener questions. But first, David, would you be so kind as to introduce our guest?
A landscape architect by training, Jack Dangermond, along with his wife Laura, founded Environmental Systems Research Institute, known as ESRI. Their vision was to use computer mapping and analysis to help design a better future. ESRI creates cutting-edge geographical information systems and geodesign technologies used in every industry to make a difference worldwide. Recently, Mr. and Mrs. Dangermond donated $165 million to the Nature Conservancy to protect 38 square miles of incredibly biodiverse, underdeveloped California coastal land. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Jack Dangermond.
Thanks very much, David, and I appreciate that very kind introduction.
Thank you to Jack. I've known Jack and Laura Dangermond for many years, and we've worked together on projects. They provided us with software, as Steve said, that helped document the urban redlining all over the country by banks and low-income areas in order to obtain compliance with the federal law on minimizing this kind of redlining, which leads to insurance redlining and the further deterioration of these inner city areas. I just read a description of this great gift of a point conception that you and Laura made to the Nature Conservancy, which is the biggest gift they've ever received. And the county supervisor, Joni Gray, said about this area of about 25,000 acres that, quote, "There's no place like it on earth. It's more beautiful than Yosemite or Yellowstone," end quote. Well, as someone who spent a summer working in Yosemite, which I thought was the most beautiful place on earth, Jack Dangermond, could you describe this area that is a peninsula, in effect, right between northern and southern California near Santa Barbara?
Sure, Ralph. It's kind of like they call it the elbow, and it sticks out and jettisons out into the ocean. And it's where the northern currents blend with the southern currents. There's kind of a down movement in the oceans and an up movement from the south. And so it's a huge, in the marine environment, biological mixing area. And of course, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and I can understand why Joni is so excited about this area. I mean, I love Yosemite, and I love the sequoias, and I love these iconic national park areas, and we all enjoy them as a society, I think, going there and seeing them. But this is a different kind of beauty. It's rugged coastline, rolling hills, and about 1 million huge, full-grown 200, 300, 400, 500-year-old oak trees. And in this environment, it's not the natural beauty that strikes you. It's from a biological and ecological perspective. It's this work going on in nature. And it has, I think, 54 rare and endangered species. And walking on the beach there, you're conscious of an unusual and beautiful landscape, but also, like every foot you take, there's, rare and endangered frogs or sensitive plant material that characterize it as unique in the world. So in that sense, it's, from an ecology perspective, a beautiful place for sure. I can talk about it all day, Ralph. It's just
well, let me run you through the history of this area, because it is one of the last unspoiled areas in California, a state with over 40 million people, a lot of development, a lot of pavement, a lot of cutting down on trees. I mean, I remember in the 1950s when I was in Southern California, I went through Orange County, and Orange County was named because it was full of orange trees. So that's no longer the case. So what is the history going back hundreds of years and starting with the Chumash tribe?
Well, this was an area of special spiritual significance to those populations. And there is currently very sensitive archaeologic sites on that area. Well, about 150 years ago, with the Spanish land grants, the land began to become owned by ranchers. And the Bixby family particularly acquired it in the early 1900s and then held it and ranched it with cattle for many years. So it's been sort of blocked off from public access for all these years, and as a result, all of this rare and endangered and interesting landscapes have been protected, as well as some of the most sensitive archaeologic and cultural sites. So the thought here was, can we keep that reserve, as a kind of living laboratory for nature to be left alone? And there are very few places, it turns out, that we can really look across America or across the world that we really have ecological reserves that are preserved. And so this brought us to this notion that let's do this and set it up as a research laboratory with the University of California, where they would observe this from a science perspective, conserve both the archaeologic and natural wonders that exist there, and let it continue to evolve.
You mentioned in one of the articles, this got a lot of national publicity, listeners, when it was announced early in January. You mentioned that the area was owned by a Boston investment group, which I guess your philanthropy purchased the land and provided it to the Nature Conservancy. What were they planning to do with this, or isn't it known?
I don't know that it's totally known. They were an investment group. I mean, Laura and I went on our honeymoon here when we were just young kids, camping along the beach, and we sort of, at that point, saw it, and I wouldn't say we had the idea. I mean, we were just a couple of poor, dumb kids, traveling along, but we saw it and fell in love with it. And so we've always kind of gone back to that idea that this ought to be a place, that really is conserved. And we sort of fell in love with it. That's sort of the essence of it. And over the years, as we did our little company thing, we, stayed to the knitting, kept working along, and built up some wealth. And we did this donation with our personal wealth, but we tried to acquire it about 12 or 13 years ago, but we just didn't have the financial means to be able to do it. And it got in kind of the family, Bixby family, these long, historically rich families. We needed to sell it off for a variety of reasons. So we got in the bidding war and we couldn't do it. So we lost it. And this financial group were able to be successful, and they must have had plans about developing it in various ways. And it could have been developed, except that all of the conservation forces in Santa Barbara County and also the State Coastal Commission have severe regulations. So in some ways, the regulatory framework within which the state and county operate in some ways protected it from just being rolled over and massively developed. But you know, the way of urban development is often that even with our best governmental and political structures, development keeps progressing. It's one of our big challenges in land use planning and growing our cities and conservation in general. So there was rumors about it maybe being able to be sold off again. So we started working closely with TNC about this, who also had ambitions to get this incredible piece of land into some kind of a reserve. So we sort of joined hands and worked carefully with this organization.
Well, Jack, just to connect with our audience a little bit, you're a friend of E.O. Wilson, the famous Harvard biologist expert on ants and his studies, among other things. And he said that, quote, "we are innately all biophiliacs," end quote, by which he meant that people are drawn to nature in unconscious ways. He adds, quote, "it's why people keep a little philodendron in their apartment or have an aquarium or dogs. People want to feel some connection to nature and the natural living world," end quote. And that really is in your own DNA, you and Laura. I mean, your father ran a nursery business. He was an immigrant from Holland. Jack, your training was in landscape architecture. And your home is a multi-acre place where you grow oranges. And you've been very philanthropic to your hometown there in Redlands, California. So why don't we get into the nitty-gritty here? A lot of questions have occurred to me. North of Point Conception is Vandenberg Air Force Base. How can you protect this area in case Vandenberg Air Force Base and the Pentagon wants to expand for national security reasons and can take it by eminent domain? What are the protections in the Nature Conservancy in other ways?
Well, the land is owned by the Nature Conservancy now, and the Vandenberg Air Force Base, I'll just comment on it, is about 3 times bigger than this land, and in many ways protects an amazing wealth of coastline and nature processes going on north of this property. And they're good neighbors in many ways. Their management policies, their structure, the information that they gather, their sensitivity to conservation in that geography has historically been an amazing thing to watch. And I know it personally because they use our software and they've shared with us some of their plans and work like that. There is reservation requirements for no development over some parts of the property because, of course, Vandenberg is where missiles are launched out. So on certain times, there's no public access by anyone over parts of this reserve just for public safety purposes. But you're bringing up an issue of can a political initiative threaten the conservation of this land? And I have worked, as you know, all over the world in efforts to do conservation in Kenya, in the UK, in South America, and here. And my bottom line on this is that while there's lots of zoning and special conditions that you can lay on property, the ultimate thing that conserves property is ownership, and ownership's by good stewards. And from my perspective, TNC, watching and working with them, is one of the great organizations that not only is acquiring land and has science-based people to figure out what land to acquire, but when they get it, they're good stewards of land. They know how to manage it with respect to fire, with respect to other challenges of land use surrounding their conservation holdings. Not that it's all good news. I mean, the world is changing rapidly. We're afraid about the future, considering things like climate change and its impact on nature. Sea level rise here will certainly have an impact on some of the near shore environments that exist. But ownership is important, and then strong people or organizations that manage that property is important. And we live in this country in a blessed situation where long before my life or your life or the listeners' lives, people conceived of the national park system. And their priority was to put into permanent preservation these grand, iconic pieces of nature. And we think of them in our mind, we visit them from time to time, but that iconic reflection that we have, our great places are treasured and set aside. And I think we now have to take another step as grand and as big as the national park step was in the 100 years ago, to preserve all these other important leftover pieces of landscape that are being challenged in various ways. And how do we do that? Do we do it just by zoning? No, I think we have to take deliberate action to acquire them and put them into either public ownership outright or into organizations like NGOs such as the TNC, and there are others.
Which raises, by the way, my next question, which is, would it have been safer if it was donated to the national park system? I know the national park system is under severe budget restraints, less than, I think, about $3 billion budget for over 100 national parks, including Yosemite and Zion National Park and Yellowstone. I mean, it's a totally inadequate budget, with the results being a lot of deferred maintenance problems and breakdowns of service systems. And I can see why, under the present political climate, you would not have wanted to do that. But did it occur to you that it might be even more secure if it was part of the National Park System than as part of the Nature Conservancy, which is a nonprofit, of course, but it's not a governmental entity that embraces places like Yosemite and Yellowstone?
Yeah, in doing this gift, we thought about a lot of different options: a national park, a state park, a state-regulated conservancy area, or TNC. And we found that this is not a political thing. It just seemed like the most appropriate place at this time was into a TNC who could actually manage it. And part of our requirement to make this gift was that TNC would reach out to other donors and receive enough money to set up a permanent management fund to take care of this land, and they did that. There were lots of generous people that stood right up with us and said, we want to set up an endowment to ensure that this is managed correctly. So I don't know the answer to your question exactly. We visited Point Reyes, for example, a beautiful national park environment which has set aside some of the wonderful areas north of San Francisco, similar in size, on the oceans. And its main focus is public education and public exposure and public recreation. That's one of the anchors of the national park system. In this particular piece of land, the idea of building it up for recreation or tourism or something like that is definitely actually inappropriate, because it would ruin this treasure ecologically. So in long talks with TNC, I mean, there will be some public access as part of this gift. There are expansions to one beach campground that will happen called Yalama. So there will be some very limited access. But TNC is now studying what parts of the rest of this ranch should be absolutely in conservation preservation versus how can we expose it so people can get a glimpse of this magnificent place.
Well, I think that's one reason why you picked the Nature Conservancy, because you can, together with your endowment at the University of California, Santa Barbara, you can be more rigorous in the preservation. If you had it in a national park, there could be all kinds of attacks in Sacramento and Washington about what should be done with it, to what extent it can be open, to tourists. And this is a very fragile area, as you say, and needs to be very carefully nurtured. Describe its expanse. How many miles of ocean shore? What's the square miles of this group of this area? And can it be expanded, say, from 25,000 acres to a larger area?
Yeah, there are some windows of opportunity here for geographic expansion of the reserve, and we will look at that along with TNC over time. Getting back to the issue about, I strongly believe, Ralph, that conservation is not about going to the right or going to the left, nor should the public really put these treasures in a political environment that can be whipsawed around at the will. I mean, nature doesn't act that way. I mean, there's the natural ecology, which we all depend upon. I mean, this is not just some nicey thing to do for an icon. No, it's the fundamental fabric of our planet is what we depend upon. I mean, plants create the air that, normal people can understand that very well. And I think, maybe that's part of the reason why we went with TNC, because they're very committed to management of landscape. And as the world changes, we need to manage the ecology instead of being a distant observer of nature or being careless in nature. We need to actually move and become conscious that we need to become stewards of nature. And philosophically, that's a shift that must occur in all of us, is that we need to take care of, we need to be responsible for healing the stuff that we are screwing up in various natural settings. So let me say one other thing, Ralph, that's really important. And Laura and I have been very fortunate in our life. I mean, we've had our little business. We've worked very hard to be able to create this as a meaningful organization. And the result has been that we have had the good fortune of developing personal wealth. And so you might look at this gift as being, some rich guy is doing something like that. If I would talk with my good friend E.O. Wilson, this isn't just about rich people, although that's an important thing that we hope people will copy, buying conservation land and putting it aside so it supports us. Everybody can do this. When we were much younger, we were active in our community planting trees. Not expensive, but we were active doing that. And then developing little parks, pocket parks, and then helping organize our community so that in community efforts we were able to get the money together to buy land or conserve a piece of land. So, I don't want your listeners here to simply say, oh yeah, this is some rich guy that's able to do this, I can't do it. No, I want everybody to realize that at this particular moment in the history of the planet, we need to act to be able to move at all levels, in cities, in suburbs, in farms, in every way, play at 100% with respect to shifting focus to conserve these natural areas on the planet.
Indeed, it's been going on a long time in towns and cities. You have Central Park, for example. In my hometown in Connecticut, we have small parks set up by philanthropists, open space, breathing space. So there's a long tradition, which leads me to my next question. I mean, your company virtually invented the digital map, geographic information systems, which I understand the original idea came from Canada, but you developed it, GIS, and you want your grant to help stimulate other people to do it on a large and smaller scale all over the country to preserve these lands as part of the ecological system without which we couldn't exist, the biosphere. Have you thought of developing maps which focus on areas all over the country that you think should be taken out of potential development or neglect and put into preserved parks or nature preserves in order to expand what you're trying to do, demonstrate by example, and stimulate other people to do it at a higher rate of diffusion around the country? And you can say, well, here are the maps, and I know it's a big job. Here are the maps, but in one state after another, based on all the data that has been available, including U.S. Geological Service and state counterparts, that could be preserved and taken out of potential commercial development and destruction.
Yeah, it's a great question, and yes, we've been working on exactly that kind of project for the last 4.5 years. The public agencies have collected massive amounts of scientific information. from vegetation coverages to rare and endangered species locations to slope to elevation to where all of these factors have been documented by organizations like the USGS for decades. And they have also digitized this data and made it available to the public. So about 4.5 years ago, we began a project called the Green Infrastructure Project, which is, you could imagine, as a series of digital map layers for the entire country, and have been now developing a process to overlay computationally these layers and weight the different factors to be able to create a map that shows the most ecologically important areas that ought to go into conservation. So as part of this gift, we are launching an effort with a nature conservancy to make such a map exactly as you're describing that would help other people say, okay, this is the next most important place. And there are lots of important places, some small, a few hundred acres, some big, thousands of acres, like up in Montana, that really should be a spatial framework for a strategy. And this map, which is also a strategy, can be used by government agencies to say, well, we'd like to increase the open space in our county or in our state. Same thing at the state level and same thing at the national level. A framework, a geospatial framework, something that everybody can understand and is science-based that can guide people to say, this is the next place to set aside. And TNC is working with us on this. They're saying, okay, we want to work with philanthropists or government agencies to help them establish these reserves and put them into permanent conservation like we did at Point Conception. And there are others, like the Trust for Public Lands is another very beautiful organization that helps local governments do this kind of ranking and thinking and integration of priorities into their land use plans.
And you know, because we're on radio, you can't see the beauty of these maps, listeners, and how much information, understandable information, can be put in layer after layer, which gets us into the next area I'd like to explore. We received a call from you a number of years ago at our center in Washington. You wanted to have us think about citizen applications of these maps, and that's what led to our mapping the redlining in city after city throughout the country by banks. But just to compress this enormous potential, which our listeners I know would be very much interested in, right down to their hometown, there's such thing as a GIS Day, which ESRI has sponsored at your local high school or community college, where people, not just students and teachers, but people can learn about the enormous enhancement of civic engagement through these maps. You can map a town and tell you where the police routinely patrol and where they don't routinely patrol. You can map a town and show what areas of your community are owned by the town government. You can map a town for all kinds of information that can provide the basis, evidence-based action. So can you describe how can people connect with GIS Day, Jack, in their community, and when is it, and what website provides the how-to right down to the detail?
Well, this is the kind of revolution that's happening in my field. When we started GIS, we did little projects. We'd gather a bunch of digital maps, and people would do a planning project or an environmental project using GIS. And then business started to use it to locate restaurants or locate factories or whatever it is. It really was project-based. And then it moved to whole organizations, like a whole city using GIS. And cities like Los Angeles or New York or Washington, D.C., they spend billions of dollars collecting and managing all these geographic layers to run the city. We call it enterprise GIS, and businesses do the same thing. And businesses are, really saving enormous amounts of money being able to use geography as a framework. In the last couple of years, building on the experience of working with you, Ralph, we have started to envision this idea of a community GIS and have invented a new technology called a hub, the GIS hub. So a city can take all of their layers and make it available over the web to their citizens. That reinforces initiatives like the opioid epidemic initiative. What can we do? Well, first, citizens want to know where it is and what government activities are going on to combat that issue, or Project Zero, which is all about minimizing or eliminating deaths due to pedestrian crossings at streets. Well, there's reasons why people get killed in streets. It has something to do with the streets or the safety or also awareness. And so in that particular case, the city of Los Angeles has extended these map-based initiatives out to their community, and it's impacting the way communities engage. So we know what a community meeting is like, Ralph. You know it in your DNA. You get people together, you get them to register, you get them to work together on whether it's parks or disease or crime or whatever it is that is of interest to the community. And the city often is the convening organization. What we've been working on with this GIS hub is a digital way to do it. And I think people still have to get together. They still have to have events and face-to-face meetings, but they really want to know what's going on, and the city often has that information. But just mere open data is not enough. Being able to have open data with maps and analytic capabilities to understand the relationships and patterns on these maps is what citizens really want. And in turn, what government leaders really want is they want to have feedback and direction by their community. So we're looking at how we can move GIS from simply helping the government be more efficient and make better decisions to the idea of bringing in all of the community, linking them by way of social media and maps and social media so that people can carry out conversations around initiative-based policies to get everybody in the city working, everybody to do a cleanup day, everybody to support their library, everybody to work on safety, on health issues, on homelessness issues. And leaders want involvement by their city, by their community, and communities want to have more information from their leadership. So we're seeing mapping as a new language, a new way to empower information quick. Like I look at a map, I see it, and I immediately understand something. And understanding precedes action. And so maps, our work actually, our life's work has all been about improving communication. And this step for me is the biggest step of my life. I'm so excited about it.
And GIS Day for high schools and colleges, can you tell us something about that?
I will. GIS Day is in November. You can read about it by just doing a web search. Another thing that, Ralph, you actually helped inspire me 4 years ago was GIS in schools. So under President Obama, we launched an initiative to give all of our software away to all K through 12 schools in America. We now have 6,500 schools that have GIS in classrooms, and kids are learning it through project-based learning exercises. I mean, the kids are learning how to do robotics, and people are learning how to do programming, but also people are learning how to do map making in classrooms to look at issues that are in their community. And you can also look at our website to find that out. It's free software and free cloud computing into virtually every K through 12 schools. And the impact of this is enormous in terms of getting young kids to understand citizenship and civics within their own community. I mean, between September of last fall and December, we had 3 million kids enrolled in learning geography and GIS, but more importantly, in a context of civic action. So now this combination of free software to all schools and also this movement to build web-based citizen engagement in communities with a hub are current big initiatives.
Just in the nick of time. I mean, there was a period years ago when geography was not taught at all in a lot of these schools, and it's really a way of taking the reality of your community and put it in visual form where you can see for yourself what the reality is, what needs to be changed. And it goes right down to, for example, telling City Hall that the routes for their trucks cleaning snow off the roads can be rerouted to be more efficient. Isn't that right?
It's absolutely right. I mean, there was just a study a couple of weeks ago in South Carolina that showed the cost benefit of using mobile GIS in public works trucks, and they showed a 40% reduction in fuel costs, and they saw over half reduction in the amount of work being done by their public works officials by connecting them with a cell phone that was map base that showed all the places they needed to go, but also the work that they needed to do. So there's a revolution happening in civic government locally. The interesting part about it is the same operational systems that people are using for their, making their government better can now be shared and made available to citizens. So citizens using cell phones can connect and find out what city workers are doing, the priorities that they have, where they're putting the cops, where they're paving roads. Mayor Garcetti here in Los Angeles has an open site of maps, and he's showing where he's paving the roads on a priority basis, and then he has discussions about that using this technology. And I mean, it is just a really amazing digital way to get citizen engagement in ways that we only dreamt of through the traditional means.
And we've been talking with Jack Dangermond, who with his spouse, Laura Dangermond, are the co-CEOs of ESRI, a company that almost invented the digital map way before Google even existed. And they've both tried regularly to get that technology decentralized and made more familiar in the hands of regular citizens in town and state and federal officials. And before we get to some questions from Steve and David, Jack, give the website again slowly where people can enter this wonderful world of GIS mapping, how it can improve their communities.
Well, our organization's website is ESRI.com. That's the basic way to get there, and it'll guide you through lots of adventures.
And the software that you just mentioned?
ArcGIS. It's the global standard for doing mapping and GIS for organizations.
Steve, David, do you have any comments, questions? You're in the blizzard in New York, David, so I can see you're preoccupied, but what would you like to
I actually have a question, Ralph, because this is very exciting to hear because my question, Mr. Dangermond, is for our younger listeners who want to be activists, but they don't necessarily want to go to law school. That's not where their skill set is. This seems to be a whole nother avenue. What would you recommend the kind of training that they should get on your systems or in mapping to actually approach activism from that angle?
Well, for serious people that want to get deep into GIS, there are GIS programs at almost every major university in the world. We have 12,000 universities that we support with our software through grants. And they're usually in the geography departments, but they're often now in urban planning departments. And so people take their normal discipline, like let's say geographic science or geology or biology, and they'll take a minor or they'll take some classes in GIS. There's another whole class of users which are using simple mapping and location platforms. We call it ArcGIS Online. And you can now take web classes from our website, or other institutions are providing these. There's large MOOCs that are available to learn ArcGIS Online. It's basically an ArcGIS mapping platform from the cloud, and people can do this in volunteer organizations. So I didn't mention this, but in fact, ESRI supports free software to all NGOs. So we have, I think, 9,000 NGOs that get free software grants and training grants from our organization. Some of them are huge, like Nature Conservancy, but many of them are little watershed organizations or volunteer organizations that organize themselves, and they want to make maps. So it starts by just making maps and doing simple analytics.
And this is all over the world, isn't it?
It's all over the world.
Like if a group trying to protect Lake Baikal in Siberia, which is so deep that it has more fresh water than all the Great Lakes combined in our country and Canada. Imagine that. You would provide them with software. The Earth Island Institute here in Berkeley hosts the citizen group trying to protect Lake Baikal. And so your reach is global, all over the world.
Yeah, we have about 350,000 organizations that actually license our software, and they are the likes of virtually 20,000 cities, all the major national mapping agencies on the planet, and industries. I mean, all the oil companies use it to drill and responsibly, we hope.
Geothermal?
Geothermal, wind. How do we figure out where? We're now calling our technology the science of where. It's all about geography. It's all about digital geography, and it's emerging as a science. Yes, kids are learning this, and it's fun. In high school, people are starting to kick in. Instead of having basketball training that, a few get to play in the NBA, no, they're taking GIS courses, and they get totally enthralled with geography as a science, the science of where, location. And, it has this appeal like video games. People can interact with it, and they can actually do real projects. It isn't like flying around on a Google map like Superman or something. It's actually saying, I want to do something about a particular issue in my community like homelessness. Let's start off by making a map. Or a group of kids in Detroit said, we want to get the lead out of our city. And they started making maps of where lead poisoning was. They organized the students as a result of that to be able to scrape all the lead paint off of dilapidated housing in Detroit. And these kids in inner city Detroit, got the lead out. And as a result of that, they got interested, and they went to University of Michigan, and they got into geography, and they built careers out of it. So this pattern of project-based learning using geography and GIS as a mechanism can be very powerful and a lot of fun.
One foreboding question. I hesitate to even wonder what the answer is going to be. Virtual reality is on the way, the goggles. Yes. How is that going to either distort or enhance what you're trying to do with GIS mapping?
We're doing a lot of it with city planning departments, where a city planning department in the past has built 2D maps like zoning and planning layers, and they show in community meetings these maps, and people kind of very abstractly understand a city plan. But when a developer comes along and they put in a high-rise building, how do you represent that on a 2D map? Well, GIS has now become totally 3D. So I can go into a city, like recently happened in Boston, and look at a 3D proposed building and look at its shadows on the public garden there or on the Boston Commons. And citizens can suddenly see with both 3D GIS visualization and also with virtual reality, they can actually walk around a new redevelopment area and say, I really don't like this. I don't want this happening, or I do really support this kind of activity. So I see it in a very positive way as a mechanism for us to use technology to have people understand. And then understanding should precede action, as one of my colleagues often says. The National Geographic Society is an amazing organization because it's worked for many years at creating and disseminating geographic knowledge. We know it through the yellow frame book, the magazine. But they are also getting into the whole world of digital geography and working with us as partners to bring about geographic knowledge understanding through not only mapping and not only storytelling through their various channels and other mechanisms, but also through these kind of adventures of exploring our world through digital geography, and virtual reality and augmented reality are tools that they're playing with kids to get them interested in having a virtual experience. We don't all get a chance to go to the Congo or to the Amazon or to other places, but if we can get a sense of what it's like using these digital expressions, it can be very exciting to children.
Well, I grew up on that little yellow magazine called the National Geographic. It's still available, by the way, in print at a very low annual subscription rate, listeners. But I also, after reading it from time to time, I realized there's no substitute for walking through the woods and the forests and running next to streams. And we've got to get children out into real nature. And that's the danger if they get too involved in the virtual reality and the goggles, that they don't commune with nature the way E.O. Wilson and you have pointed out repeatedly. David, do you have a question of Jack Dangermond?
Well, the Barbara Ehrenreich, we've talked about this, has talked about how expensive it is to experience nature. I just wanted to thank you because it just seems like the rich are the only ones who can really enjoy nature. It's just gotten so expensive.
Well, I agree with Ralph that there's nothing like experienced experience as opposed to non-experienced experience. And the ability to go deep and literally smell, see, feel, sleep within natural areas is something that is disappearing to vast quantities of people. So one thought that I have as a landscape architect is to bring nature back into cities in more healthy ways. So it's not just looking at the mountains or thinking about my experience in a national park. It's actually bringing plants, bringing trees, and putting them into trees in natural ways, not like hedged trees or rows of trees like I often see in Washington, D.C., but almost random scatterings of and combinations of plants, so I can run out and be spiritually inspired by the naturalness of things rather than the human organized things that often wind up as a result of. I mean, the French landscape architects were this way. They organized these long allées and hedged everything. The British, in contrast, were for many years looking at the naturalness of parks and gardens and urban landscaping. So I tend to always favor that British approach to bringing nature into cities.
For years, the New York Times had this summer program where they take low-income children and bring them out into the countryside in New England or upstate New York. And I remember one article really made me astonished because I grew up in the country, and that these little children had never put their feet on soil before in their lives. It was all cement and asphalt and not nature. And we have to be very careful that we don't abstract nature out of millions and millions of young children's lives.
Where it becomes a conscious decision to experience nature as opposed to just it being a constant around you. I think it's the Fresh Air Fund, right?
Yes, that's right. Well, we're out of time, unfortunately. Been talking with Jack Dangermond, who with Laura Dangermond are the co-CEOs of ESRI. That stands for Environmental Systems Research Institute in Redlands, California, a major local philanthropist there as well. Thank you very much, Jack. Before we close, once again, the two websites for people to connect.
ESRI.com and ArcGIS.com.
There you are. You can decentralize what you've been hearing about right down to your local neighborhood, your community, your town hall, your community college, your high school, and nobody be happier to hear from you than Jack and Laura Dangermond. Thank you very much, Jack.
Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, Mr. Dangermond. Before you go, I just have one last question. It's not to put you on the spot, but what was the one use of your mapping system that you said, wow, I never thought of that? What's the most unusual use you've encountered?
I would say that, and Ralph, this is just a message to you. I mean, you inspired me in my life. It definitely took a different vector as we met each other during the 70s and 80s. It certainly gave us a more purposeful direction in our life. So what I get most excited about is when kids take our technology and do creative things with it. It's not about just learning, but it's actually about them getting involved. And our favorite little school is Roosevelt High School in downtown Los Angeles, where each year we bus out all the kids that are active in this area, and they bring us maps. They get on our little stage. They show what they're working on. These are all inner city kids, many of them in illegal immigrant families. They're the bottom end, poor, and they are totally inspired by the technology, and they make maps on everything like homelessness or violence in their city or lack of good food in their cities, and they study the problems. I mean, one that impacted me greatly was this study by these three young Hispanic girls, and they mapped out pregnancy in high school or teenage pregnancy. And they showed a map, first digital map showing in California where all the teenage pregnancy was, and it was by zip code. And we were all, oh, isn't that nice? These young girls are understanding that there's spatial distribution of teenage pregnancy, blah, 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 blah. Then they showed this map that said, and here's where all the sex education is taught in the schools. And everybody said, oh my gosh, all right. So, and there was absolutely a correlation. And then they showed this graph that showed the statistical. These are 14, 15, 16-year-olders. The statistical correlation using regression analysis, and they said we should, you know what? So you don't see that kind of stuff coming out of teenage kids. Or another one was a young girl got up and said, here's the average amount of money that people spend on high school students across Southern California. And she touched the Roosevelt High School, and it was about $3,200 a year per student. And this was, by the way, in front of 17,000 of our users at the San Diego conference. And everybody's looking at this young girl saying, yes, 3,400 or something like that. Isn't that nice that she knows that? Then she rolls her little mouse over to Beverly Hills and she clicks, and it's $11,000 a student. She just picks up her little finger and she, moves it across the audience. These are people from all over the world. She says,
what's amazing is that the education,
she said.
The education has led to self-education, creative self-education that's assertive and not just a matter of knowledge for knowledge's sake. It's assertive.
No, these kids are alive. There isn't anybody telling them what to do. They're doing these little projects in their community, and one after the other. That young lady is now getting her PhD at University of Michigan. She got into Irvine with full scholarship. Let's just use a phrase like she got out of the ghetto, and her life totally changed. And we just have about 80 of these students every year on that one high school that do these projects, and they just inspire each other to be able to do great things. And so, yeah, I mean, if you want to ask me emotionally what's the most exciting thing that I've seen, it isn't the advanced science. It's the engagement that kids get and the excitement that kids get to turn their life into a meaningful life through this kind of activity.
Well, this is an example. Two people, Laura and Jack Dangermond, look what they've spawned all over the world, all the way down to local communities. From 1969, when they started this little tiny company called ESRI in Redlands, California. Once again, Jack, thank you.
Thank you, Ralph.
We have been speaking to Jack Dangermond, president of ESRI, the software mapping company, who, along with his wife Laura, donated $165 million to the Nature Conservancy so they could preserve 24,000 acres of California coastland. We will link to ESRI and other of Mr. Dangermond's work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Now, let's see what kind of mischief the suits are up to and hear from our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. You are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Back after this.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Wednesday, March 14, 2018. I'm Russell Mokhiber. After an 8-week trial in New York City, Joseph Percoco, a former top aide to Governor Andrew Cuomo, was found guilty of conspiracy to commit honest services fraud and solicitation of bribes. Joseph Percoco was found guilty of taking over $300,000 in cash bribes by selling something priceless that was not his to sell, said U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Berman. As every school child knows, but he corruptly chose to disregard, government officials who sell their influence to select insiders violate the basic tenets of a democracy. We will continue to relentlessly bring to justice those public officials who violate their oaths by engaging in this especially offensive misconduct, he said. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. We have some time for some listener questions. This one comes from Spencer Snyder, who wants to talk about the politics of classical music. And he says, I'm a composer in New York, and I've noticed many musicians criticize others for bringing politics into music. They claim that classical music is sacred and shouldn't be infected by current affairs. They feel the concert hall should be an escape from these things. What would your response be?
Well, it's the old answer. It depends, doesn't it? If there's a real emergency and there's no audience on the mass media for what these people want to say publicly, and lives are at stake, for example, to take a graphic illustration in terms of a hypothetical, then you say, well, too bad. I mean, little attention to something serious that a musician wants to say on the stage, and then we can spend the rest of the time enjoying the music. Obviously, it can be taken to an extreme. It can be in poor taste. It cannot deal with important, urgent matters. But I think we shouldn't be categorically prohibitive on this. You can see in the Academy Awards that there are times when the audience doesn't like to hear it, like when Michael Moore was on the stage, having gotten the Academy Award for the Best Documentary during the early years of the criminal war of aggression on Iraq by George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, he got booed more than he got applauded when he made a comment. But now, you see, because of the sexual assaults on women by men in positions of power, that became an okay time to make a statement.
Another great question. This is from Johnny Santiago. Ralph, could you please share some of your own strategies for maintaining healthy reading habits? I struggle to find the energy to engage in reading for pleasure after a busy day. I have a stack of books next to my bed that are mostly half finished, and I've been stuck in this cycle for years. Please help. Wow.
This is like a Dear Abby.
I think we all share that feeling. There are more books than we have time to read. One suggestion is learn how to skim a book. If you want to sample a lot of books and you're never going to get around to it, some people have almost a fetish. They want to read every page. I often want to do that. But I've learned how to skim a book. You read the preface, you read part of the first chapter, you read the conclusion, you get the essence of the book, you look at the index, see if there are any particular subjects that you want to go into a little bit deeper. And, within an hour and a half, you've squeezed a lot of the nutrition out of the book, where otherwise it might take you 6, 7, 8 hours to read.
Wow.
I like that metaphor.
Yeah. I wish we could do an entire show on how to read. I'm being serious. How to read.
Also, I don't mind marking up a book in pencil. Some people think that's defacing a book, but I find that when you go back 5, 6 years later and you want to get a quick reacquaintance with the book, it really helps to have some markings on the pages where when you read it the first time, you thought there was an important point that was made.
Even if it's a library book.
No. No, never touch a library book with a pen or pencil.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Can I push back on that? Because
I've been confused.
Because with Kindle, with Amazon, you can group the annotations. You can find out what other people are annotating on a Kindle book, which is kind of interesting.
If you do books online, I don't do books online.
Well, thank you for your questions. Keep them coming either on Ralph's Facebook page or on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website. I want to thank our guest today, Jack Dangermond, president of ESRI, and along with his wife, Laura, conservators of 38 square miles of California coastland. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the wrap-up.
For Ralph Nader's weekly column, go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
And don't forget to visit the American Museum of Tort Law and go to tortmuseum.org and check out the Tort Museum bookstore and mark them all up for engrossing books and memorabilia.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, Steve and David. We'd like more listeners, so spread the word. Talk the show up. Try to get local stations to carry it. We're picking up more stations. And do what one listener told me a while back. They actually had friends in their living room, and they heard the program and discussed it afterwards. Because we always try to leave you with something to do, something to connect with.
Hi, this is Jimmy Lee Wirt, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Welcome to the wrap-up, where we were able to spend an extra couple of minutes with Jack Dangermond.
Jack, tell Steve and David how many people come to your annual convention in San Diego.
Well, we have about 17,000 that come, and they come from 67 countries, typically.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing event, Ralph. We also have a federal users conference that happens week after next in D.C. There'll be 5,000 federal workers that come. It's kind of numbers weird. Are really... They all take 2 days off and come over to the convention center, and they share their work. I mean, it's not a typical vendor to a user relationship. They feel genuinely part of our organization. And our company is organized in such a way that we basically get this money in and we spend the money on them. So the whole purpose of the organization is really to support them in their work. And so we get inspired by virtually every, whether it's Starbucks and Walmart or Swiss Rail or whoever it is, or the thousands of government agencies. We basically keep making the software better for them so that they can do their work better. That's our basic motive. So they all love us, and they work hard to push the envelope in doing significant projects and mapping all over the place.
Jack, it just occurred to me, I really have to apologize to you. I've anglicized the pronunciation of your last name. And Steve, it's Dangermond. It's not Dangermond, right?
It doesn't matter. No, everybody calls it. I don't have any way to.
You actually sound more like a superhero if it's Dangermond. That's just my opinion.
Yeah.
How do you feel on that?
I would go with Dangermond.
Yeah, anything that you guys feel is fine. It doesn't matter.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week when Ralph welcomes back Michael McPherson, Executive Director of Veterans for Peace, on the anniversary of the beginning of the Iraq War.
Stand up, you've been sitting, ready to